Hi, welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I'm sharing a list of classic middle grade books that I think you should read even as an adult. So last month I did a video where I talked about 30 classic novels that I thought everyone should read. And there were some people in the comments that were suggesting certain books that were children's classics. And I intentionally did not put any children's classics on that. I just made it entirely like adult classics. And then I had several people saying, well, you should do a list of children's classics. So I decided it's middle grade March this month. So I'm going to go ahead and post this video about children's classics that I think you should read. A small caveat is that quite a few of these are more on the modern classic ends. Typically, I would say that a classic should be 100 years old or more. Everyone has differing opinions on what counts as a classic, but that's what I think. That's my personal definition that I typically go by. But when you look at like the definition of a children's classic online, it says that it's something that's transcended time and been enjoyed by multiple generations because it has like a timelessness to it. The oldest books on this list are still like from the 60s. I think there might be one or two that are from the 70s. So they are books that my parents could have or maybe did read as children. And then I've enjoyed, and then I've shared them with my daughter. So technically that's 3 generations. So I feel like that counts. I didn't include anything that was published when I was a child that then I passed on to my daughter. I suppose I could have because that's still 2 generations, but I didn't. So there isn't like Harry Potter on here or like The Giver or Number the Stars or like some of the other like more modern classics that were from my generation and beyond. They're all at least a generation older than that. So let's dive in. These are in no particular order. I am going to start with Homer Price by Robert McCloskey. Robert McCloskey is often known for like Make Way for Ducklings and Blueberries for Sal and all these really lovely picture books that he did. He also did this really lovely children's like more of a chapter book about Homer Price, who is this boy who lives in this town. It's very like episodic and just the hijinks he gets into and the different interesting things that happen in his town, and it's just so lovely and cozy. This list would not be complete without a Frances Hodgson Burnett, and I did kind of struggle a little bit with which one to put on here, and I landed on The Secret Garden because it's my favorite, probably my very favorite book of my childhood is The Secret Garden. So I had to include that one, but honestly, you can't go wrong with A Little Princess or Little Lord Fauntleroy. Like any of those could have had a place on this list. An author I didn't find out about till I was an adult and I read her books with my daughter is Elizabeth Enright. And again, she has several like Newbery winners or Newbery honors, but the book that I'm going to put on here is The Saturdays. This is actually the first book in a quartet about a family, and it just follows these children. It has great sibling relationships. I feel like Elizabeth Enright writes about childhood in such a beautiful and significant way to where you read it and you're like, oh yeah, that's exactly how I felt when I was a kid. She just captures the magic of childhood in such a special way. One of my favorite middle grades of all time is The Phantom Tollbooth, and not enough people talk about this book. This book, everyone should read this book. Everyone. It's amazing. It's so funny. If you like witty wordplay, you will love this book. I feel like this list definitely needs to have a Roald Dahl, and you could put all kinds of different Roald Dahl in this slot. Like again, like there's just so many. He wrote so many books that have become really, really iconic in our society, but I am gonna go with kind of like the more obvious choice and say Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. If you've not read that one, it's just so incredible. It's better than the movies, even though the movies are great, but it's just so magical, but also very like pithy and snarky at times, and it's just like super enjoyable. There's also a sequel, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, which nobody ever talks about, and it is a whole lot weirder than Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, but it's one of those books that I read aloud to my family, like me and my husband and my daughter, and we laughed hysterically. Like I had to stop reading at a certain point, and it's one of our most favorite scenes from any book that I've read out loud. Of course, we are including The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe on this list, a fantasy classic that has inspired many others. And you've probably read this, honestly, but if you haven't, you really should. It's beautifully allegorical in a way that you'll really appreciate if you're a Christian, but even if you're not a Christian, it's just so magical. Another book that I would kind of group in that same category is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, because again, this is a fantasy classic, and Tolkien and Lewis were BFFs. And the reason that they wrote both of their books is they were talking about how there was no good children's literature that was coming out at this time, and so they decided to write their own, and they are both so wonderful. I actually like The Hobbit a lot more than I like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but they're both wonderful. Another very prolific children's author that I had a hard time deciding which one of her books to put on here is Beverly Cleary. I finally landed on The Mouse and the Motorcycle because I feel like it has more universal appeal. And you could go with, Henry Huggins, you could go with the Ramona books. Personally, I loved Ramona when I was a child, but as an adult, I found her actually quite annoying, and I don't like the Ramona books very much as an adult. I actually preferred the Henry Huggins books as an adult, but I like The Mouse and the Motorcycle even more. It's actually the first in a trilogy, and all of them are excellent, but I really love the first one. A book that surprisingly I find a lot of adults have not read is The Wind in the Willows, and I think that this book is just beautifully written. It is perfect for springtime too, so if you're watching this during the spring, you should really pick it up because it starts with this animal, this mole, waking up from his hibernation over the winter and cleaning out his burrow, and then he can't keep cleaning with the spring cleaning because he has to be outside because the weather is so beautiful. And the nature writing is really lovely. The friendship between these animals is really lovely. It has a lot of hilarious moments and hijinks, especially with their friend Toad, and it's just a great time. Another favorite of my childhood is Heidi, and this is one that holds up so well in adulthood. It does have beautiful nature writing, but it also has a lot of really beautiful, I don't know if found family is the right term for it, because it's about this young girl who her parents have died and she has been brought to the mountains, the Swiss Alps, to live with her grandfather because her other relatives are like, I've taken my turn with her. It's your turn to take care of her. And he's a grumpy old man, and she's just so sweet, and she melts that heart of stone, and it's just so beautifully written, and I love it so much. I debated about whether or not I wanted to put this next one on here because it's really weird and I have really mixed feelings about it, but it's also a really influential book, and that's Pinocchio. If you thought the Disney movie of Pinocchio was weird, the book is much weirder. It has a lot of interesting moments and things of discussion that I had with my daughter. I actually read it to her when she was quite young. I think she was like 6. And it was one of her favorite things. She just kept rereading and rereading and rereading it. But it's still really well written, but it is really weird. But I felt like I should include it anyway. Another book that is much weirder and much darker than the Disney adaptation of it is Peter Pan. And Peter Pan is so good though. And I think it's a kind of a divisive book because some people are like, this is so dark for a book that was intended for children, and it is, but it still is just, I feel like it was so well written and I really, really enjoyed it. On a much lighter note, a really sweet and funny book is Mr. Popper's Penguins. This is just a delightful story, which actually I think they made a movie adaptation of this semi-recently, as in within the last 10 years or something like that, about this man who somehow ends up adopting these penguins, and then they have babies and they live in this apartment and they're trying to figure out what in the world, actually it might be a house, but what in the world do we do with these penguins, and how do we, it is just it's so funny and lighthearted and just wonderful. Next up is a book that greatly shaped my imaginative play as a child, and that's The Boxcar Children. I feel like this is such a great book. They went on to write more and turn it kind of into a mystery series, and I don't think the rest of the books are that great. They're not that good of quality, in my opinion. Claire went on and read some of them as a kid and enjoyed some of them, but I did not really enjoy the rest of them as a child. I really only liked the first one. It's about these 4 orphans, and they don't want to go live with their grandfather, so they just go and they run off and they live on their own in a boxcar. And the way that they live on their own and provide for themselves, and it's kind of almost I want to say it's like a survival story, but it's not as dramatic as the story of like My Side in the Mountain or Hatchet or something like that. They're not really like in the wilderness. But I used to love pretending that I was in a boxcar and I was like cooking and doing all these things and foraging. And like it was just like a very integral part of my childhood. One of the older books on this list was actually from an author that was a great inspiration to C.S. Lewis, George MacDonald. And so that book is The Princess and the Goblin. This is a beautifully written story with a lot of really lovely allegorical components, but it's also one that like you could enjoy even if you're not looking for the allegorical components, because it's just a wonderful story about this princess and this boy that she befriends and the adventure that they go on, because there are these goblins that live under the castle that the princess lives in, and they're plotting to like take over the kingdom. And it is just like really, really wonderful. No children's classic list would be complete without an E.B. White. And any of his books, again, are wonderful and have had like lasting impacts on society in terms of adaptations. But I'm gonna go with like the cheesy mainstream answer because my favorite is Charlotte's Web. I think that it's just incredible, a beautiful story of friendship and farm life, and it's just amazing. If you're an adult and you've never read this, you should totally read it, even if you don't like spiders, because one of the main characters is a spider and the other one's a pig. But even if you don't like spiders, this will be the first spider that you love, I promise. The next book on this list is Anne of Green Gables, which you could say maybe is not a middle grade book, but I think I don't know if it was originally published specifically for children. I feel like it probably was, but it's just so beautiful and it transcends age to me. Like this is a timeless book that anyone of any age in any time could enjoy. Anne is an orphan girl who is so imaginative and endearing, and it just has beautiful found family elements. It's so quotable, it's hilarious at times, and just like completely steals your heart. Next up is another influential book that has had many adaptations, and that's The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling. The interesting thing about The Jungle Book is that it's a compilation of stories about these jungle animals, and the one that's most commonly known is the story of Mowgli, and that is what is typically in the Jungle Book adaptations. But there's a ton of other stories in this collection, and so many of them were so hilarious. I did not read this book until I was an adult, and it was assigned to my daughter in school, and I was reading it out loud to her. And it is hilarious at times and like super adventurous and interesting at other times. It's really, really a great book. Another older author that I feel like has to be on this list is Edith Nesbit, who was quite prolific also. She mostly wrote fantasy. She did write a historical one called The Railway Children, which didn't have any fantastical elements in it at all. So if you're not into fantasy, maybe that's the Edith Nesbit you should pick up. My favorite Edith Nesbit book is The Enchanted Castle, and it's very magical. I think that Edith Nesbit is more well known for like Five Children and It. That's probably like her most popular, like it actually, she turned it into a trilogy. So that's probably her most popular. Those are my daughter's favorites. But my favorite is The Enchanted Castle, about these children that end up in this enchanted castle and they find like a magic ring, and like there's just like all these creatures, and it is like, it was so fun. I really loved it. On a more serious note, a historical fiction that is one of the newer books on this list, but I felt like it deserved a place on this list because it is one that I think is important to read even as an adult, is Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. This is actually, I think maybe it was a Newbery winner. Also, if it's not, it should have been. And it's a story basically of this Black family during the Civil Rights Movement, and it is really heart-wrenching to read at times, but so well executed. Next up is a book that I hear people talk about a lot in homeschooling circles, but it wasn't one that I heard about when I was a kid, and it's not one that I hear people talk about who are not part of homeschooling circles, and that's Understood Betsy by Dorothy Canfield Fisher. This is a story of a young girl who lives with her aunt, who almost wants to put her in bubble wrap and like keep her safe. And so she's instilled so much fear and timidity in Betsy, but then she gets sick and Betsy has to go live with family from like her other side of the family. And they live on a farm and they do not coddle Betsy. And it's really interesting to just watch Betsy grow as a person and become totally different. Another historical fiction is The Door in the Wall, and this is actually set in the Middle Ages, and it's about a boy who gets the plague and like all of his family dies, and he has actually become crippled as a result of the plague, but he is still alive. And so it's kind of his story of overcoming and regaining strength. A really quiet little book that I think is actually out of print, but you should still be able to find it at libraries or maybe find it used, is The Wheel on the School. This is a story of a little Dutch school, and they have these storks that come and nest in their town, but they haven't come in a while. So they have these wheels that they put on the roof of the school that then the storks can come nest in, and it's the story of these children like observing it, and it's just like a really quiet, slow story, and I really love it. Another iconic book that has been made into so many adaptations is Paddington, and there's a whole series of Paddington books written by Michael Bond, and they're just so delightful and so funny and sweet. They're just really short little reads, and if you're looking for something cozy and humorous that feels nostalgic, Paddington fits the bill. Another author that I don't hear people talk about very often is Marguerite Henry, which is really a shame because I think that she has some of the most beautiful writing. Like, she's incredible. When I was a child, I loved Misty of Chincoteague, and this is actually based on real life events that happen in, I think it's like an island off the coast of Virginia, I want to say, where there were these wild horses, and every year they would like try to catch these wild horses as they would swim from the island to the mainland. And so this is about this boy and this girl, and they are determined to catch this horse, and they named her Misty. And it's just like, it is such a well-written story, and like most girls, I totally went through a horse phase, and this was one of my favorite books during my horse phase. A really funny book that I absolutely love and highly recommend is Half Magic by Edward Eger, and this is actually, I think it's a series. I think there are more books that he wrote, but I've only read Half Magic. It's a story about these siblings, and they find this coin, this strange coin on the ground, and they realize that when they they can make wishes on it, but when they make the wish, only half of it comes true, and they have no way of knowing kind of how this is going to work out. So they keep trying to make wishes and kind of trying to hedge, so they'll wish for twice as much of something, knowing that the coin is only going to grant half. And it's just like, it's so funny. It's so enjoyable. I loved it so much. Another very influential classic is Alice in Wonderland. Again, one that's like super weird. I feel like a lot of the really influential classics on here are super weird, and even weirder than the adaptations that were made of them. So you probably have seen the Disney cartoon Alice in Wonderland, which actually combines elements from Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, which is the sequel. And so it has like some characters from both. I actually kind of like Through the Looking Glass just a little bit better because it has to do with like a chessboard, and there's like some really interesting things in there, as opposed to like the Red Queen, the Queen of Hearts is what it is. The Red Queen is from Through the Looking Glass with like the chessboard and stuff. But the Queen of Hearts is the one that's in Alice in Wonderland. But they are just both, I love them both. I think they're whimsical and funny and really well written, but also like kind of feel a little trippy at the same time, where you're like, what is going on here? So I think that they're really fun though. Maybe they're not for everyone, but because there's been so many different adaptations and retellings and all these things of it, I feel like it has to be on this list. That like, I love when there's something that has so like permeated our culture, going back to like the source and reading the original. Another very influential over time book, well, actually series, I guess, is the Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder, which I feel like is still totally worth reading as an adult. They had so much historical value, and I feel like kids nowadays should read them too. I mean, there are definitely some problematic racist elements, which is what's going to happen when you read classics, unfortunately. But if you're reading those with your children, that is such a great opportunity to have conversations about those things. So I still think that they're still so valuable and still so wonderful. A translated classic, which there are several on this list actually that are translated, that I may not have even said that they were translated when I talked about them, but The Little Prince, this is one that I feel like is good for children, but it's so good for adults as well. And I know that this is some people's like favorite like children's classic. So this is probably not a surprise that this one's on this list, but it's really deep about the meaning of things, and it's just really, really well done. A newer classic on this list is A Wrinkle in Time, and this is a sci-fi written by Madeline L'Engle, and it's actually a series, and I don't think I've gone on and read all of this series. I think I've read a couple of the following ones because I think it's either 4 or 5 books. I can't remember. The first one's the best one, in my opinion. And it's about this girl who ends up trying to like travel through time and space to try to find her father. And it's just like, it's really fascinating, but there's a lot of really great like life lessons and quotable things in it as well. Next up is one of my favorites, and it's one of those ones that you feel like, oh, this is for little kids. It's not. I promise you, it's not. And that's Winnie the Pooh by A.A. Milne. Is it cozy? Yes. Can really young children enjoy this? Yes. Are the cartoons geared towards tiny kids at times? Yes. But did I read this first as a teenager and fall in love with it? Yes. I did not read this as a child. I grew up watching the cartoon, but I didn't read it as a kid. I didn't read it until I was like a teenager, and I reread it multiple times as an adult. When I tell you this is funny, it's so funny. And that's actually why Eeyore is my favorite, is because of the books, not the movies. Like in the movies, he's like gloomy and kind of funny and sarcastic. And in the books, he's like over the top sarcastic. He is so funny, and I love him so much. But in general, just like the whole thing is just so wholesome and funny. And the sequel, The House at Pooh Corner, is just as amazing. We've come to the last book on this list, and it's another one that has a Disney adaptation, and that's 101 Dalmatians by Dodie Smith. I didn't know until about 4 years ago that there was a book. I thought it was just a movie. I had no idea. And the book is even better than the movie, as is typically the case. I do feel like Disney was actually very faithful to this book. Like there's a lot of similarities and there's not a lot of deviation. But I actually thought that the book was funnier and more well done than the movie. So I tell people all the time, I'm like, if you did not know 101 Dalmatians is a book, like you need to go read it because it's so good. Well, this is my list of children's classics I think even adults should read. You should read them with your children if you have children, but if you're an adult and your children are grown up or you don't have children or whatever, I still think all of these are well worth reading. I would love to hear from you in the comments down below. This is a limited list. I actually cut this list down from like, it was more than twice as long. So there are a lot of books I didn't include. So I want to know what books would be on your list. Because I think that how we grow up and what we read while we were growing up obviously greatly influences this. So I would love to know, what would you include on this list of middle grade books, children's classics that everyone should read? Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.